Hi, welcome to another Infinity Terrain video. So firstly, apologies for the gap in videos. We've been quite busy at the moment, but there's a whole load of new videos which are queued up and will be released over the coming weeks. This video is going to be a little bit different. We're actually going to talk about 3D printing and how it relates to wargaming and in particular Infinity. So on the video at the moment, you can see there's a couple of different models. So there's a couple of the cars from Antonosi's Workshop Kickstarter recently, and a couple of the models from the Dragon's Rest range, also originally a Kickstarter, but now you can purchase them from their website. So originally, I actually got rid of my FDM printers, which are printed these ones here, and went for a higher quality resin printer. But more recently, there's a lot of Kickstarters coming out with a lot more terrain, and some of it's quite large pieces that are just not suitable for resin printers. So I've actually picked up a couple of other FDM printers now as well. So firstly, let's talk about the two different technologies in 3D printing. So there is actually some other technologies at the higher end, but at the consumer end or the hobbyist end, there's two main technologies. There's something called FDM printers, which is fused deposition modeling. What that basically means is it takes in a material, typically PLA or ABS, which comes in a filament, so a string, effectively feeds it into a hot end, which melts it, and then it puts down a tiny layer of plastic. And the head basically moves around, layering plastic on top of plastic on top of plastic until you've got a model. They're the cheaper printers and the most common printers. So that's FDM printers, and that's what's printed these two models here. Now there is a big price difference between different types of FDM printers. You can go from low-end kits to high-end FDM printers that come with a lot of features. So it's not just used by hobbyists. The FDM technology is still used quite often. The other type is a DLP resin printer, which is what these pink models are. Now that gives you a much higher quality, but there's a lot of drawbacks as well. The way a resin printer basically works, if you imagine there is a UV light which shines upwards, so a series of UV bulbs. There's the equivalent of what a mobile phone screen on top of that, and it's just the screen. And what the screen effectively does is it forms a mask. So if, for example, you wanted a circle, it would basically form, the mask would form everything apart from the circle. So basically the screen goes black apart from a circle in the center, which then allows the UV light to shine through that gap, that circle in the center of the screen. It then hits a vat of UV sensitive resin, and that resin then cures just a very tiny thin layer against the build plate. That build plate then moves up a millimeter or a micron or whatever it happens to be that you're actually using your dimensions on. And then the mask reforms into the next type of pattern. The resin then, the light shines back up, cures another layer, and it moves up. So basically it's like, if you imagine like taking millions of or hundreds of photographs as each layer being a photograph. So as the printer goes up, basically each one of these layers is effectively a different slice that the software has worked out for you. Now let's think about price ranges. So I have 3D printers at the moment. So originally I got rid of my FDM ones, as I said, but I've actually got a couple of FDM ones again now because there's a lot of large stuff that I want to print. And resin printers are a much smaller footprint, so you can only print much smaller pieces. So they just weren't suitable for that. So at the moment I have an Ender 3 Pro, which you can see a picture of on the screen at the moment. Now, the Ender 3 Pro comes from, you can get it from Amazon. It comes in a kit form. You are going to have a little bit of experience in being able to build one. Mine was actually built by Chris at Monstrous Makings, which I'll put a link to in the link below. He sells a lot of Infinity related 3D printed stuff, and we'll go on to talk about some of that later. But he's already got two Ender 3 Pros, so he has some experience assembling it. So he helped assemble mine and just made it a lot easier for me when I was buying it. Now from Amazon, an Ender 3 Pro, it's actually about £230 roughly, but as I say, it'll take you a little bit of time and experience in building it. At the higher end, I also have a Prusa Mark III. Now the Prusa Mark III is a much higher quality FDM printer again, that comes with things like auto bed leveling sensors. It can detect filament breakages. It's generally a much higher quality build and with a lot more features in it. It's a lot more expensive, however, so rather than 230, an unassembled Prusa Mark III is about £700 or £900 if you get them to professionally assemble it for you. I got them to professionally assemble it for me, so I could literally take it out of the box and I was printing in a couple of minutes. And it is a lot faster and the quality is better, I think, than the Ender 3. But if you're willing to spend the time on the Ender 3, I've seen plenty of people get similar qualities or better qualities by really tweaking their Ender 3 to get it running really well. So if you just want something at a cheaper end range, the Ender 3 is probably the one to go for. Now on the resin printer side, the Anycubic Photon, which is the resin printer, you can see the picture of that on the screen at the moment. It comes in around about $380 on Amazon at the moment. There's lots of sales, so watch out for a flash sale. I think I got mine for about $350. There's also a newer version of it coming out called the Anycubic S, which has got a white plastic case rather than the black metal case. Now it has two Z-axis rails, so the metal rails at the back that basically make the printer very stable. So that's a vast improvement over the original one. Other than that, apparently the internals are all very similar. As far as material costs go, I use PLA to print, and I use a reasonably quality of PLA. So a kilogram reel is about 20 quid. You can get kilogram reels of PLA much cheaper, but you can sometimes get snags. Sometimes the quality isn't as good. It's really about finding a PLA that works with your printer and sticking with that manufacturer. I'm happy to spend a little bit more to get better quality and to have consistency. Resin is about £45 a litre. Now, the way the two different printers work is FDM will have what they call infill inside. So inside it has to basically remain as a solid object. So inside the object, it'll actually print out like a hashing pattern of just so that the layers have something to adhere to as it works its way up. Whereas resin, you can actually print hollow. So if you notice here, you can see the holes on the bottom. So when I put that model into the software, I hollowed it out and then I had it put holes in it so that as it printed, the spare resin would actually drain out of the inside of the model. So you can actually get reasonably good or reasonably cheap models in resin printers because you're just generally printing a model which is generally a millimetre shell. So again, if you look underneath here, you can see there's a big hole in the bottom of the car. Again, because that is it was to allow the resin to drain out of it as it was printing, so you're not wasting or trapping resin inside the model that you're never going to be able to get out again. As far as ease of use goes though, so FDM printers, literally you print it, you take it off and that's it done. Just prime it and away you go. You may want to sand it and try and improve the finish if you really want to. Whereas resin printers, completely different situation. You have to break off all the support material firstly. I'll talk about that in a second. You've then got to put it into a quick bath of IPA alcohol at around about 99% 97% plus. That's to wash off all the residue of the resin from around it. Then you need to agitate it in some water to get rid of any of the IPA. Then you need to cure it under a UV lamp, which is basically just a nail lamp, so you can get them off Amazon as well. And that basically hardens it to the point where you can actually have something which you can paint and print. Whereas, as I say, FDM, literally print and away you go. Now, resin models, even resin printed models, you may wish to clean up a little bit. Now, generally, I found the quality of the Anycubic's pretty good. Now, support material. Most of the models, particularly the Dragon Rest range, so this sort of stuff here, have been designed to be printed without any support. So you just print it vertically and the printer will handle it. The model's been designed in such a way that it will print. Whereas, as you can see on the screen at the moment, pictures of what a printed resin model looks like. You generally end up printing at an angle and you end up with a lot of support material around the side. And you can see here around the rough edges, that's where I've deliberately left that a little bit rough, but that's where the support material was attached. Now, obviously, what you would normally do is you would sand all that bit off and clean all that up. Now, in this case, that actually looks worse than it probably should because I didn't really tune the support pieces. In the software, you can choose how close the support material goes to the actual model. I should probably have pulled the support material a bit further away from the model to make it easier to come off in that case. So that's the differences between the two types of printers. So let's talk about the models and the quality then. So let's start with the FDM one. So this is the FDM model. So this is one of the Antonosti's Workshop STL files from their Kickstarter, and there'll be a link below. And as you can see, it's really good quality. You can see the lines, but you're going to get that anywhere with FDM printers. Now this is just printed at a fairly fast speed. If you were to really tune it, lower your speeds and lower the amount of material you were putting down at a time, things like this you could get rid of quite easily. And similarly, you could sand some of this down if you really wanted to get it much smoother. But that's a perfectly usable, model that you could sit down on a table, and it probably cost about 60p, to print something like that. Now, underneath where I put the supports on, you can see it's a much rougher looking model. That was because I needed some support material on, because it's actually got a gap underneath, so I had to put some support material on this one. So it's ended up looking much rougher. But again, you can tune your support material again as well, or you can try and print vertically if you wanted. I decided not to try and print vertically because I wanted it to print quickly, but also I didn't want the risk of it slipping either way. Now there's lots of settings you can do in the software, like rafts and stuff, to try and avoid that. But let's look at this. This is a much probably a better model to look at. So this is one of the planters from Dragon's Rest. So this has actually come out really well. So if you look firstly at the base piece, you can see the quality of the actual the planter piece itself is actually really good. The lines are barely visible. Now on the plant pieces, you can see there's lots of little sort of like bits that you may want to clean off. That's generally where the print head moves from one bit to the other. You can get what's called stringing. Now again, you can improve some of that with various software settings, but actually, given it's meant to be the plant side of things, I actually think that looks quite good. Now, if we look at the resin version, you'll see the resin version is even smoother. You know, there's no lines. It looks really, really good. So apart from the bits where the support material, but then if you look on the other side where the support material isn't, you can see how pure you can get it. The downside being, obviously, this bit here is snapped off, because the resin stuff is much more brittle than FDM. So again, you need to be careful about the difference between the brittle nature of resin printed stuff compared to the FDM nature. So there's the two models side by side. And as you can see, the resin one obviously is a better quality, but there's nothing wrong at all with the FDM version. So let's look at the cars side by side. So again, you can see how really nicely the car has come out in the resin piece. And let's compare that to the FDM version. Let's just put them side by side. And you can see, although it's still perfectly usable, but you can see the difference that the resin printer makes. So what you'll generally find is, if you're printing things like cars and small objects, the resin printer is always a better option. But the bed size is much smaller. So you can maybe get the bed size of a resin printer is about that, effectively. So that's about as much as you can fit on a resin printer, those two cars together probably. Whereas the bed size for an FDM printer allows you to print things like this. So again, this is another model from the Dragon's Rest range. This is one of their power generator pieces. And as you can see, it looks really good. It's a really solid, it's really solid plastic printed model. Again, there's a little bit of stringing that I've not cleaned off. So if you look around here, you can see where the print head has moved and it's left a little stringing behind. But as you can see, you can just take that off with your fingers or clippers, or a little bit of a light sandpaper. But something like that is just totally impractical to print with a resin printer. You would have to slice it up to a smaller size probably to fit it on the bed. You might just squeeze that one on actually, but in general you would have to. And it would take a lot longer. Now, if we look at some of the other stuff you can do, now this is where it starts to get even bigger. So effectively, this piece here is about as large as I can go on an FDM printer. But again, if you look at the size difference here, this is a huge piece. Now I can fit something alongside this, but that's about as high as I was willing to go on an FDM printer. But that printed as one solid piece. Literally, I just left the printer going. Took about 10 hours. So again, you've got to remember that in this sort of hobby, it takes a long time to print this stuff. Don't expect for something to pop out in an hour. I mean, yeah, if you're doing the planters, you might get that done in maybe an hour and a half. But something like this, you're looking at leaving the printer running in an environment where you can monitor it. Now, I have IP cams sitting on mine, so I can watch them as they're printing, just in case you get a snag or a filament and you need to intervene, or something goes wrong and you end up with if a support fails or something collapses, you can end up with like sort of spaghetti sort of a picture where basically the filament just starts pouring out into thin air and it just ends up in a sort of cloud of filament. So I'm going to do a video that covers Dragon Rest stuff specifically, but I wanted to show you some of the advantages of the FDM stuff again. So resin's very brittle, so I did try printing some stuff where you're going to have clips in resin, but it just doesn't work. The resin just snaps. Whereas because FDM is basically a plastic, you can print these little clips that are designed for the Dragon's Rest piece. So you can see there's lots of different clip mount points. So if I snap that in there, you can see it just snaps in, and then you can build it up. So similarly, these are more of the Dragon's Rest pieces. So if I wanted to, for example, I could then have, well, that's not going to work there, but if I snap that off there and put this here, you can see that I can then have that piece coming out here. So if I then, it comes with various supports as well. So you can see I've now got a piece that's now got support on it. And there's various junction pieces as well. So you can see here I've now built a junction. And then again, if I want to support that junction underneath, I can just put this into one of the sides. So the Dragon's Rest range I'm really interested in. We're going to do a whole board out of the Dragon's Rest terrain. So there will be a separate video on this one once I've got some more of it printed. But yeah, so what sort of other stuff can you do with the printers then? So as mentioned earlier, Chris at Monstrous Makings, he's playing around quite a lot on different products that might be of use to the Infinity community. So a couple of the really good things he's done is, one, he's done a set of the card holders for the mission cards in red and green. So because you end up with two decks, a red and a green deck in the current ITS strategy, and you'll play one or the two in the tournaments, but often they get mixed up, etc. He's designed this deck holder, which I'll put a link into below, where you've basically got your red side and your green side, and you just put your deck in the center of each, and it works really nicely. Also, he's got some silhouette markers now. So if you want a three-dimensional silhouette marker rather than the flat silhouette markers that you get from a lot of the acrylic manufacturers, that sort of stuff's available as well. How does it compare to MDF? Well, obviously your initial investment for a printer at the cheaper end is around about £200 to £300 probably. By the time you bought some extras and some filament, etc., you are going to use filament when you're making them up, so it's not necessarily cheaper than getting an MDF board, a laser cut board. It really depends what you're after. If you're going to do more than one board, or you want a lot of scatter terrain, then it starts to get a lot more economical to get a 3D printer. If you're in a club environment, it might be worth you getting a 3D printer amongst the club and then allowing different people to use it, just to save on the initial cost of the printer, and then obviously you can print off a number of tables. Most of the licensing restrictions around the STL files that you can get off Kickstarters, so things like Antelosity's Workshop and Dragon's Rest, you're allowed to use as much of the files for your own personal use as you want, as long as you're not commercially selling those items on. And even if you do want to commercially sell them on, i.e. print them and sell the printed products, then generally those companies do have commercial licenses which are available. So you can approach those companies and ask them, what would the licensing fees be if you were to do that? And there's a few companies who will actually print out the Dragon's Rest stuff in particular for you, and then obviously they pay a licensing fee back to Dragon's Rest for the use of those files. But if you were like in a club environment, there's nothing stopping you building some tables for the club, as long as the club wasn't selling those tables on. But yeah, it's a really interesting area. Originally, I thought that 3D printing wasn't really going to take off into the wargaming stuff because it was just a lot of work, and there wasn't really, the files that were out there weren't that good. But now that the Kickstarters have kicked in and people are producing really good high quality files with a lot of thought into how they fit together and how printable they are, I can see it, generally you're not going to get this level of detail or three-dimensional nature in an MDF kit. MDF kits are generally very flat. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see what different companies come up with and what people do board-wise with this terrain in the future. Now obviously you can mix and match it. You can mix some of it with MDF terrain and some of it with 3D printed terrain. So hopefully you found this video useful. As I say, stay tuned probably next week or the week after for the Dragon's Rest video, which will go into a lot more detail about the different options, different build patterns for the Dragon's Rest stuff. We'll try and get some of it painted up as well, so you can see how the 3D sort of lines effectively that you get in the sides show up once you've actually got some paint and primer on those pieces. If there's any questions, comments, please leave them in the comments field below. Thanks very much for watching.